So we got to do these without calculator. Now, if I were doing this problem with my calculator, I'd have a couple different ways I could do it. I could do 75 times 0.1, or you could even set it up as a proportion, and you could do like 10 over 100 equals, like 75. We'd want to know what that percent is out of 75, so like x over 75 kind of a thing. You could do it either way with a calculator. But how are we going to do it without a calculator? Well, technically you could do it either way still, but I think it's going to be a lot easier to think of it this way without the calculator. Remember the rule for if I multiply something by 10. Let's do a little quick practice with that. I'm going to take a random number here. I'm going to make it 98. What's 98 times 10? That's 98 with 1 0 after it. What's 98 times 100? A 98 with 2 zeros, so 9,800. You notice the pattern here? So like 98 times, let's go times 10,000 this time. That'd be 98 with how many zeros after it? 4. Because there's 4 zeros here. And so we have to add 4 zeros there. Now, let's go the other way. What if I do 98 times 0.1? It has the opposite effect, where multiplying by 10 basically took the decimal and it moved it over one place. Multiplying by 100 took that decimal after the 8 and it moved it over 2 places. And so you'll notice there, like if I took the decimal here and moved it over twice, that's how I end up with that. We can do the same thing here, except when you multiply by something less than 1, it moves the decimal the other direction. And so this is actually going to equal 9.8. Now, let's extend that out. What if I did times 0.01? I made up 98 just as an example. So, if you do 98 times 0.01, do you see what that one's going to be? It's going to be like taking that decimal that's after the 8 and moving it over twice. And so it's 0.98. Now, seeing those examples, remember I made up 98 just as a random number to use as an example, so I can now go back over here. What will 75 times 0.1 be? 7.5. There we just did it. Quick and easy without a calculator. We figured out what it is for the sales tax. Now notice we're not done with this answer though yet. Because we want to know how much will we have to pay total. In order to figure out the total then, we're going to have to do 75 plus 7.5. You can do that without your calculator. So, what's 75 plus 7? 82. And that 0.5, notice there was a decimal only in that one, so it just carries through. So the whole thing ends up being 82.5. Or in other words, if I want to make it pretty, $82.50. And it was all done with just mental math. So each of these numbers are going to work the same way, where we go ahead and find out what 10% of it is. Basically, we're just moving those decimals over one place. So for that first one, 40 times 0.1. It's going to be 4. Notice it's just 4. It's not 4% or anything like that. It's just 4. 392 becomes 39.2. 3. Well, if I have a decimal after the 3 like this, and I move it over 1, notice that becomes 0.3. So I'm going to make it 0.3 there. The 4.5, we actually have a decimal written in at the start here. Move it left 1, and notice it's going to be 0.45. So you notice how all these things are running. And so these are all of those answers where we figured out what 10% of each one was. We're just moving that decimal over one place in order to be able to do this work in our heads. No calculators needed then. And that's the great part about it. All right, now, here, we're going to be applying it. You know that tax is about 10%. And we're going to go ahead and use that. So if tax is 10%, what is the total cost of each of these 6 items? All right, now I want to make sure you're heading in the right direction here. So let's do the first one, then I'll give you some more time to do the rest. So 240, the first thing we need to do is figure out what 10% of 240 is. That would be 24. But this one's not done yet, because that tells us how much we're having to pay in tax. Well, I still want to know what the total cost is. So total cost is going to be 240, the original price, plus the tax. So plus 24. And so that's going to give us 264. Now, if you have any trouble with the addition, great strategy. Line them up above each other. And it just helps to organize your thoughts. Because that way you basically are just adding straight down. Makes it a lot easier. Now for this next one, we're looking at 19.99. Well, technically 10% of that would be 1.999, but that's kind of ugly to work with. I don't want to have to mess around with that. And I actually have an escape here where I don't have to do that. Because notice it says estimate.
So 20.
So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call this 20. Now I'm just going to work with 20. So that means I'm going to take the 20 and I'm going to add 10% of 20. What's 10% of 20? 2. And so 20 plus 2 equals $22. There's our estimate. Now, if you want to be really picky about it, you might say, okay, well then it's probably going to be $21.99. Well, that would be basically true if it was exactly 10%, but odds are the actual tax rate where we're buying this is like 9.9% or 10.3% or something like that. So we're still just ballparking. All right, next one, 650. I'm going to go ahead and use it as 650. So that means the tax, I'm going to do 650 plus 10% of that, which is going to be 0.65.
Wait, what is taxing for?
So from here, we need to add these up. Now, some of you might be looking at 650 plus 0.65 and thinking that's pretty tough to do. If that's the case, here's the trick for how to add decimals. Line them up just like we lined up the numbers earlier, but when you do so, make sure you line up the decimal points. They have to be in the same place. So notice it would actually be written like this. And then you can go ahead and just add them straight down. So you get a 5 there. Nope, we got 11, so I carry the 1. And notice the decimal just carries down to the same exact place. So you get 7.15. So the whole thing is 715. All right. Next up, we do it for 90. That one's pretty easy, right? So then for 90, we take our original 90 and we add 10% of that. 10% of 90 is 9. And so that one's going to be $99. Okay, next one, $49.99. That's ugly, right? Yeah, let's call that 50 for doing our work here. And so then I'm going to be doing 50 plus 10% of that, which is just 5, so 55. Makes those a lot easier. All right, and this last one, we can go ahead and do it with the 1550 as we see it. So I'll go ahead and call that then, oops, not equals, plus 1.55. So I'm going to do 1550 plus 1.55, which is going to give me 1705. Now, if that one's a little bit too tricky to do in your head though on the fly, you could always change that in your head, call it 16. And you could do it that way if you want to just get a kind of a ceiling estimate. That is like an upper limit estimate to make sure you got enough. Now in doing these, the first one, we already know how to do that one. That one's pretty easy, right? 10% of 40 is just going to be 4. Okay. But now, how would we find 20%? Well, what do you do to 10% to turn into 20%?
Add a 10.
Well, you could add 10% Although I think it's going to be easier for our purposes here if we think about it as multiplying by 2.
How'd you get 8? So 8?
So notice, if I know what 10% is, I can double it to get 20%.
Yup. Right.
10%.
Okay. So then what if we want to go to 5%? Yeah, that's half of it.
Divided by 4 times 2.
So we can divide it by 2. So that's going to be 2.
Excuse me?
So then for 70%, how are we going to get 70%? Well, that would be 10% times 7. So that would be 4 times 7, which is 28.
I'm getting better at mental multiplication.
Okay, what about 1%?
10. I mean, like 4.
The answer is 0.4.
I didn't even know that.
Now, there's 2 ways you can do that. One way you could get it is you could actually say, well, I'm going to do 40 times 0.01. And we saw earlier that means you move the decimal over twice. Or 1% is actually 10% of 10%. So you can actually take the 4 that you found earlier for 10%, and you can move that decimal over one place as well. They both do the same thing.
15%.
But now 15%, that one's a little more awkward. Do I really want to have to do this times 1.5?
It's 6.
You don't have to, because 15% is 10% plus
That's it.
5%.
I did not know if it was going to be able to do plus.
And so, yes, we actually can just do the 4 plus the 2. So yes, it's going to be just 6.
Who's making up?
All right, so if we're going to do this problem now, figure out how much are we really going to be bringing home. We're going to be having to figure out what 20% of 11 is first. Okay, well, what's 10% of 11? 1.1. So if I want 20%, whoops, there we go, 20%, that means I got to do 1.1 times 2. So that means 2.2. So in other words, when you're working and getting, say, $11 an hour, $2.20 of that is going to the government to pay for roads, to pay for Social Security when you're older, which is a nice safety net, some things like that. But how much are we actually going to get home? Because right now what you really care about is how much do I get to spend when this paycheck comes. So we would then do 11 minus the 2.2. Now, if some of y'all have trouble subtracting with the decimal, so I'll show you a little trick here. What is 11 minus 2? 9. Well, then I can do the 9 minus the 0.2, which would be 8.8. That means that when I do the 11 minus the whole 2.2, it's 8.8. So in other words, you're bringing home about $8.80 for every hour you work.